So, on to our last two talks. The first one, we've swapped round, Jeremy, who's going to give more of an introductory and theoretical talk, and Martin Brunner, who's going to speak second. Jeremy, I believe you live in Hertfordshire now. I gather you've been a psychiatrist and a psychotherapist at UCL and more recently at Exeter.
More recently, I've been 35 years in North Devon, and then a professor in Exeter running the psychoanalytic psychotherapy research and training program for the past 15 years or so, since I retired from the NHS.
So that's a goodly
Don't you say any more about me?
Okay, I'll let you get on with your talk. Thank you very much and look forward to hearing it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I think the evolutionary group probably didn't exist when I was active in the college, when I was chair of the Psychotherapy Faculty. I'm very much in awe of the talks we've had so far. They've both been absolutely brilliant. And of course, as usual, have said everything that I was going to say, only much better. So I shall be, at least to some extent, repeating what's already been said. Now, I'm very aware, and I'm going to be absolutely strictly stick to time, but I think half an hour is my allocation. So the only other point to make is that I do live currently, but only for another 2 weeks, in a rural area, and the broadband speeds are rather slow. So Adam very kindly is going to manage my slides. So I'm just going to say next slide, which will be rather irritating, but that's the way it's going to go. So this is the plan of my talk. I'm going to make a few general remarks. I'm going to give what I see as a kind of update on attachment theory and evolution from Bowlby's original ideas. And then in a way, the bit of the talk that's in any way new is I'm going to talk about what's known as universal Darwinism and the free energy perspective and the free energy principle, which is an area of psychiatry and psychology that I've been interested in recently. And then I shall just make some very, very perfunctory remarks right at the end about implications for psychotherapy. I should say I'm primarily a psychotherapist, a clinician. I wanted to show Charles Darwin and Emma Darwin. Such a lovely picture. I'm going to read rather a dubious poem. It's a poem by Carol Ann Duffy, who was poet laureate until recently. Comes from a book called Wives of Great Men, and the title of the poem is Mrs. Darwin. 7th of April, 1872. Went to the zoo. I said to him, something about that chimpanzee over there reminds me of you. Well, as I say, it's a possibly slightly politically incorrect poem, but it does raise one or two points that I just wanted to put into the mix today. Because there's a kind of echo, of course, of the famous, although possibly apocryphal debate between Thomas Huxley, who's generally described as Darwin's bulldog, and Bishop Wilberforce. And Bishop Wilberforce supposedly said to Huxley, on which side of your family were you descended from apes, your mother's or your father's? And as I said, it comes from Wives of Great Men. What's interesting, I think, is that this poem puts me in mind of this idea of weirdness. Now, weirdness, I'm sure you're familiar with this, stands for Western, industrialized, educated, rich and democratic. And the argument that of Henrich, who's developed this idea about weird, is that most psychology studies are made in the West, and in particular actually with North America, with psychology students themselves, and therefore represent a very atypical sample of the world population. And his argument is that weirdness emerged and evolved when the Catholic Church banned cousin marriages. And Darwin and Mrs. Darwin, otherwise known as Emma Wedgwood, rather refute this idea because they were first cousins. And they both came from incredibly talented families, the Wedgwood families and the Darwin family. And their offspring have contributed hugely to the intellectual life of the West. And they represented an enormous sum of, you might say, intellectual capital. So the weird concept doesn't really stand up very well when one thinks about Emma and Charles Darwin. Talking about couples, we've already seen Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlby, but Mary Ainsworth somehow seems to take a second place when people think about attachment theory, and yet there would really be no attachment theory, no attachment research had it not been for Mary Ainsworth. And we'll come on to her a bit later. Both the points on that slide have already been made, so I shall move on. Oh dear, sorry, I haven't said next slide, please. Are you catching up? Are you keeping up with me, Adam? We've got to the slide to Shanksky, Huxley, and evolutionary trials.
I've got it. You're very clear, so it's fine. I'm carrying.
Okay, next slide, please. Now, Bowlby was, as has already been said, right at the beginning, Bowlby described the two grandparents of attachment theory. If the parents were Ainsworth and Bowlby, the grandparents were, on the one hand, psychoanalysis and Freud, and on the other hand, ethology, and that of course takes us to Konrad Lorenz in particular. But Julian Huxley is a very important figure in this. Julian Huxley was Darwin's bulldog Huxley's grandson, brother of Aldous Huxley, the novelist. And he wrote an incredibly influential book called Evolution, the Modern Synthesis, which really brought Darwin and Mendelian genetics together. I'll come on to that in a minute, and it's already been described beautifully by Marinus anyway. And the sort of ethology that lay behind attachment theory was the product of Lorenz and Tinbergen, who's already been mentioned, who jointly got one of the very few Nobel Prizes for psychology, you might say. And Bowlby was very influenced by Tinbergen, and again, Annie's talk covered this. So John Bowlby took really Tinbergen's ideas and said, well, let's study human beings in their natural state. And there's a picture from one of the Robertson films, which has already been mentioned. And these were, as it were, descriptive and qualitative studies using film of the impact of admission to hospital in the 1950s, where children were separated from their parents for very short times, you might say, compared with the institutional children that Marinus has been talking about. But just for a 2-week separation, the Robertsons and Bowlby found had a big effect on children's psychological life. Move on because Annie's covered that slide. So Bowlby and Hinde together were very influenced by this idea that our psychology, and in particular our attachment behavior, could be understood in terms of the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, which again Marinus has touched on. This is sometimes seen by critics of evolutionary psychology as what's known as just so stories, a kind of story you can tell about the past, and very hard to evaluate or validate. But the Bowlby-Hinde idea was that we grew up in an environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, where humans were at huge risk from predation. Compared with our predators, we can't run very fast, we didn't have very strong teeth or limbs. We really only had two things that enabled us to thrive or survive. And one was the big brain. The trouble with the big brain is it has to get through the birth canal, and therefore we have to be born in a state of huge vulnerability. Takes a year for us to walk, whereas in the fields where I live this time of year, lambs are up and walking within about half an hour of birth. So on the one hand, we have our big brains, and the other hand, we have each other. And this was the kind of Hinde-Bowlby idea that those infants survive because they have behavioral mechanisms which are summarized as attachment behavior when threatened, which enable the caregiver to look after the child. Now, what I want to do in this talk, those are just sort of introductory remarks really, is to say, well, we now, I think evolutionary theory has moved on, and we now have to think in terms of what Leyland calls the extended evolutionary synthesis. There are many aspects to this, some of which have been touched on already. I'll just very briefly mention three. So we have to, we're beginning to see that phenotypes and genotypes interact all the time, very much as both Annie and Marinus has said. And this is a two-way relationship. But when we think about our environment, we're no longer thinking about the Olduvai Gorge and where we evolved. We're thinking about, as it were, a contemporary environment. And the contemporary environment, the niches in which we live are essentially social niches. So it's people who constitute both our predators and our attachment figures, or the absence of our attachment figures as illustrated in Marinus's talk. So we need to think about how we create our own niches and the interaction between the environment and our genetic makeup. Secondly, we need to think about multi-level selection so that we're no longer thinking about individuals. We've got to think about ourselves as groups. And to summarize the work of David Sloan Wilson in his wonderful book, This View of Life, which I strongly recommend to anyone who's interested in evolutionary principles, within groups, selfishness trumps altruism, but between groups, altruism trumps selfishness. And I'll try and expand on that a bit later. And we've already touched on the idea of life history theory, epigenetics, and neuroplasticity, and I'll give a few examples of that in a minute. So the idea I want to put forward is that although attachment may have evolved as protection from predation, its current function, or it's moved on from that to provide a platform for social relatedness. And this can be compared with the evolution of feathers in birds, so that originally, as it were, proto-feathers were seen in dinosaurs as ways of keeping themselves warm, but they gradually evolved into the instrument of flying. Well, similarly, we could say that the attachment relationship started as protection from predation, but has evolved into a platform for relatedness. And so I'm going to suggest that in a current way of looking at attachment, we have to think of it as a culturally transmitted relational platform. And I'm going to touch on some of these aspects. So don't worry if they aren't entirely clear, because I hope I'm going to clarify some of them. Biobehavioral synchrony, shared attention, contingency and marking, mentalizing and theory of mind, and epistemic trust and thinking through other minds. I think what's interesting is that Bowlby really, although he usually would argue that the main function of attachment is protection from predation, and therefore the attachment relationship which is triggered, or the attachment dynamic which is triggered by threat. If we look at this section from his first volume of the trilogy Attachment, he draws on Ainsworth, and it was Ainsworth who suggested that maternal sensitivity was the key theme which differentiated securely attached infants from insecurely attachment infants. So we're moving on now from this idea of the attachment dynamic as protection from threat into the idea that the attachment relationship provides affect co-regulation. And Bowlby, as well as being influenced by Robert Hinde, he was also influenced by another contemporary biologist, Waddington, who had this idea that we need to think in terms of developmental pathways. and that once one is, as it were, embarked on a particular developmental pathway, then that becomes self-reinforcing. So if we think about affect regulation, feeding provides a context for it, and what we see in secure attachment is how the securely attached infant is an environment, has a caregiver who is able, as it were, to accept both positive and negative affects, and there's a lot of evidence to support that. Whereas in insecure attachments, what we see is that painful feelings are unacceptable to the caregiver and therefore have to be repressed, or they're kind of unregulated and unmodulated. And both of these represent risk factors. But as Annie has said, evolution wants variation, depends on variation. And in order to encounter a whole range of different environments, we need, as it were, a range of different ways of responding. And I think this is illustrated beautifully in the life history of Viktor Frankl, the founder of existential psychotherapy. He was a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst in Vienna in the 1930s. And when the Anschluss happened, when Hitler invaded Austria, he had a chance to escape. He had a chance to become a professor at a university in America. He was invited. But he was a very securely attached individual, and he was extremely worried about his parents. And so he decided that he should stay with them. So that's an example of secure attachment. Inappropriate in that environment, because by staying with his parents, both he and they were taken to a concentration camp, where they, but not he, succumbed. In the concentration camp, Viktor Frankl befriended one of the guards, and while walking out, being marched out onto their stone-breaking tasks, this guard used to talk to Viktor Frankl, and especially about his marital difficulties. And as a result, the guard favored Frankl and gave him slightly larger portions of food, and probably in that situation, that context, Frankl's secure attachment disposition enabled him to survive. So his life, to my mind anyway, illustrates the very point that Annie was making about the environmental context determines whether or not secure or insecure attachment is of survival value. I think we've talked quite a bit about Belsky's hypothesis that we need to think in terms of neuroplasticity and not vulnerability, and that in favorable environments, plasticity genes confer advantages, in adversity, disadvantage. So this is the orchid and dandelion metaphor. Just to give another example of this, that I have always been very struck by this particular study. So Belsky and Fearon took a group of 1-year-old and 1.5-year-old girls and classified them as securely or insecurely attached. They then followed them up for the next 10, 12 years until they reached menarche. And the interesting thing was that secure attachment predicted a later onset of menarche. So and you could then argue that in adverse environments, it's a good idea to be able to, as it were, get on with your sexual life. And it makes a very powerful, I think, argument that the attachment relationship absolutely impacts on our biology. Similar kind of study that Steve Suomi did with macaque monkeys. So he he divided monkeys into those with short or long alleles in the dopamine group, and he put them into two groups. He put the infants into, as it were, a gang rearing situation where they're brought up by peers, or a mother rearing situation. And these monkeys had access to alcohol, and he measured the amount of alcohol they took. And what his study showed was that those with short alleles drank more alcohol than those with the long alleles in the adverse, as it were, gang environment, but in the more benign environment, they drank less. So it's another example of the dandelion and versus orchid metaphor. This slide simply shows the point that when we think about a human environment and the niches in which we inhabit, we're really talking about other humans. And what differentiates our species from our ape cousins is this collaborative aspect, the joint attention, the proto-conversations, the turn-taking, the joint intentionality. And we can see this in this lovely videotape from one of Tomasello's studies, where he shows a little 4-month-old infant with his mother, and they're interacting beautifully. And then the mother is asked to create a still face for 1 minute, and we see that infant regress into an incredibly backward state in which he could be a newborn child. The quality of his cry, the quality of his behavior regresses massively. So what this study shows, or what this particular videotape shows, is the way in which our psychological state in infancy is actually a joint state. It's a kind of what some people call that little child outsources his affect regulation to the mother. And these are just some slides that illustrate some of these points. Here's another example. Here's a frog in a bucket. And you've got to imagine a 2-year-old with a caregiver, and that frog is going parp in the bucket, and that infant is eye referencing with the caregiver. Is it all right to approach? Is this something safe? And to the extent that that caregiver is able to give that child encouragement, to the extent that the child can trust or can endow that caregiver with epistemic trust, so the child is able to explore his or her environment. So the point I'm making here is that when we're thinking evolutionary, we've got to think in terms of humans in their social context all the time. Here's another example where this is slightly older children, age 3, 4, 5. They're shown hybrid animals and asked whether that's a cat or a squirrel, and depending on the context and their attachment status, they are able either to make informed and sensible decisions, to think for themselves, or either to think too much for themselves or to be too dependent on what other people say. So we begin to think in terms of secure attachment, as it were, providing a platform where someone can begin to have a mind of their own, and insecure attachments, as it were, where you're in a situation, if you're avoidant, where you don't find it easy to trust others and to draw on their knowledge, or if you're insecure, ambivalent, as it were, to be over-trusting and not to develop a mind of your own. And in the insecure, disorganized situation, to trust no one, to have what Peter Fonagy calls epistemic hypervigilance. Now, have I got 10 minutes more, Paul, roughly? I hope so, anyway.
About that, yes.
Okay, now you've seen this picture already, rather interestingly. Now, the important point here is that Charles Darwin developed the principle of evolution by natural selection, but he had no idea about its mechanism other than that children tended to resemble their parents. I think we psychotherapists and psychoanalysts and therapists generally are in a slightly similar situation, in that we know that psychotherapeutic treatments work, but we've no idea really what the mechanisms are. And I'm going to try and suggest that there are now, in the ideas that have been developed by Paul Friston, who is my sort of Mendel equivalent, we can begin to think a bit, or understand a bit better, what it is about the therapeutic relationship that produces change. And I'm going to take an evolutionary approach to this. One of my favorite pictures, but I think the important point about that picture is that it's a combination of chaos and order, because if you think of the boundary of that picture, the frame, as it were, is entirely ordered, and yet the content is chaotic. Erwin Schroedinger, who was a physicist, Nobel Prize-winning physicist and one of the founders of modern physics, quantum theory, asked himself and wrote a little book called What is Life? And he decided that life was negentropy. Life, as it were, refutes or works against the second law of thermodynamics, which says that the universe and that everything is tending towards disorder and uniformity, whereas life consists of order and, as it were, individuality. So if we go further with that, Carl Friston has picked up on this idea and says that we can think about the brain in similar terms, that the brain is all the time trying to order and structure our life. And we can think of it as a Darwinian machine. And I'll try and explain what I mean by this in a minute. So if we think about the fundamental triad of evolution, variation, selection, and replication, we're all the time trying to predict what's going to happen in our environment. We're all the time adjusting what our predictions are in the light of our sensory experience, and we then modify our picture of the world in the light of that. I rather like this summary of it. Man proposes, God disposes. Well, I would say top-down proposes and bottom-up disposes. So what do I mean by this? Well, the mind is bombarded with sensations from our exteroceptors and your interoceptors. So we're learning all the time, or we're getting information all the time about what's going on in the outside world and what's going on in the inside world. And we've got to make sense of this. We've got to create some kind of order out of this chaos. So we make probabilistic estimations of how important and relevant this information is, all the time trying to eliminate surprise or free energy. If you think about the visual system, we've got a pre-existing model of a cat in our mind. So if we see a creature with whiskers and a tail, we immediately see that as a cat. And in fact, anatomically, there are more top-down fibers to the visual system than bottom-up. If you think about, if you're a jigsaw player, as some people might be, particularly in lockdown times, you know how much easier it is to do a jigsaw when you have a pre-existing picture on the cover of your box than if you had no idea who the artist was or what it was that was being depicted. So we're all the time, as it were, creating our own worlds. But there's always a discrepancy between our picture of the world, our model that we use to explain the sensations coming in, and the actual sensations. So, and those represent, that discrepancy represents free energy. We're all the time trying to minimize free energy, and the way we do this is with the help of others. So we really are now in a world of two-person neuroscience. And here's a little study that explains this. Jim Cohn and his colleagues in Maryland decided they wanted to understand or study the neurobiology of happy marriages. So they advertised in the local paper for happily married subjects. About 150 of people applied, and he then selected about 50 of them, and they had to be very, very happily married on the basis of a questionnaire. My wife and I carried out this questionnaire. I don't think we would have been included in the study, sadly. And what they found was this. They put the wife, it was a bit unfair, but the wife was put in the fMRI scanner, and she was told, you're going to experience a mild electric shock to your left leg at some point in the next 20 seconds. So this was a threat model. And under three conditions: holding her partner's hand, holding a stranger's hand, and holding no hand. And then they looked at the HPA axis, the stress system, if you like, and unsurprisingly, there was far less stress when you were holding your partner's hand. They were a bit worried that the sort of Trumpian alt-right would pick up on this and said, there are Christian marriages, all that matters. So they did the same study with gay couples and found an even more marked effect there. So the argument is the dog that didn't bark in the night. Why is it that there was so little stress response when you're holding a spouse's hand? And the argument is that secure attachment provides a shared niche, and the stress is experienced by the wife, but by outsourcing as it were, the stress, she was able to survive much more effectively. So I'm just going to end by trying to apply some of these ideas in a sort of clinical context. So Annie pointed out that disorganized attachment is highly correlated with psychological disturbance in later life, and in particular, perhaps with borderline personality disorder, which Martin's going to talk about in a minute. We can think about disorganized attachment as a possible borderline personality disorder precursor. Peter Fonagy and others think of the psychological state of the disorganized attachment infant as one as hypervigilance. So these are people who are essentially on their own. They can only rely upon themselves. They cannot rely upon a caregiver. Now, there may be very, very adverse circumstances in which this is the most appropriate strategy. And actually, Lalonde, who's looked at this kind of issue in a more evolutionary context, his main target organism is the stickleback. And looking at sticklebacks, he finds that sticklebacks watch each other and learn from each other, except in rapidly changing environments. So it may be that these very adverse and rapidly changing environments that the disorganized children face mean that they have to rely on themselves. And some of the symptoms that we see in borderline personality disorder and later can be understood in these terms. It can be thought of in terms of pathological self-soothing, so dissociation, bizarre posturing, repetitive self-injury, all these risky sexual behavior, alcohol addiction, all these phenomena can be thought of in terms of how do you soothe yourself? How do you regulate your affect when you can't trust anybody else to help you with it? How can we help with this? Well, we have to foster universal Darwinism in the consulting room. Let's go back to variation, selection, and replication. So, in a way, what we see in psychopathology is that one is, or our clients or our patients are kind of stuck on very rigid and often rather simplistic top-down models. And psychotherapy, the purpose of psychotherapy is, as it were, to increase the range of different possible ways of thinking about experience, counterfactuals, if you like, fostering the imagination, fostering dream analysis, being more open to experience, particularly to interoceptions through free association. So we've got a bigger range of variation, then selection. So in other words, if we think about the environment, what comes in, often our clients are paralyzed. They have no agency, they have no sense of self. So we need to foster that sense of agency so they can explore different kinds of environment and not feel so frightened by the unexpected. And finally, we need to validate new generative models and routines. One of the key interventions which Fonagy and Bateman have suggested in working with borderline personality disorders, what they call pressing the pause button. What is pressing the pause button? Well, there's a kind of automaticity between one's top-down models of the world and what's coming in from the outside. When you press the pause button, you say, hang on a minute, let's just stop. Let's just think about what happened. Let's not assume we understand everything that's happened. So that is, as it were, inserting a wedge between top-down models of the world, these rigid ones, and very selective attention to only certain bits of environmental input. The concept of earned security and attachment theory is somewhat questionable, but nevertheless, it seems to me that what we have to do with our borderline patients is to help them to earn a bit of security. So how do we do that? Well, there has to be gradual establishment of epistemic trust. It takes a long time. I saw a patient a while back who told me she'd had a previous analysis. It was only after 9 years that I suddenly began to trust my therapist. Well, I'm not suggesting all patients need 9 years before they can trust their therapist, but we have to accept that there's going to be huge difficulties in the early stages of therapy. Patients who either don't turn up or sometimes refuse to leave even. And then we have to have this idea that the client begins, once they trust you, to outsource some of their affect regulation to you, what I call the borrowed brain. We have to kind of create manageable chaos. We have to extend the range of top-down models. We have to help clients listen better to bottom-up interoceptions. And with all this, with earned security, then the individual is equipped to adapt to a wider range of self-other niches. And one of the ways we do this is fostering mentalizing. How do we mentalize? Well, mentalizing, I like to compare it with learning to play cards. You learn to mentalize by putting your cards hands up. And that's really what Freud meant when he said to his clients, tell me everything that comes into your mind, however irrelevant, embarrassing it may seem. So if we can just begin, as it were, to learn to think about our thinking in that kind of way, then that increases this range of adaptation possibilities. So this is my last slide, I think, or all but last slide. So what have I been saying? Well, the title of this seminar was Darwinian Roots and Branches. So I'm saying that we've moved on from Bowlby's original idea, the selective advantage of attachment, a security provision in hostile environments, to an attachment as a basis for niche co-construction, affect co-regulation, thinking through other minds, and ultimately consciously directed cultural evolution. Thanks for listening, and that's the end of my talk.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. That was really nice. I really enjoyed that. I was just going to say, you actually wrote a book about Bowlby.
This is true.
Did you want to say anything about it, or?
Well, virtually everything I've written is either about attachment theory or psychoanalysis. But one of my very earliest books was John Bowlby and Attachment Theory. And there's a revised edition, 2013. And Marinus was very generous in that he actually, I think, showed a picture from it, or mentioned it anyway.
Oh, lovely. Because, of course, Bowlby wrote probably one of the best biographies of Darwin ever. So there's a direct connection there somehow. So thank you very.
Oh, if I can, okay, you want me to plug my book? I mean, the point about
Go
my book,
on.
the point of my book is that, you know, the trilogy, the Bowlby's trilogy, which is absolutely wonderful, and I class it with Proust and Ulysses, but it's very long. So I tried, as it were, to summarize some of the ideas from attachment theory in a more manageable form.
Well, thank you very much. There's one question from Jerry Rafferty, and I'll read it out. In emerging EUPD patients outsource their emotional responses, this would appear to be consequent on invalidating environments, often challenging ones, which would seem to be the source of the insecure attachment styles. In therapeutic terms, how can we deploy evolutionary principles to inform treatment?
Well, I think what I was trying to say in my talk was that if we think in terms of contemporary evolutionary theory, we have to think in terms of, in a way, breaking down the idea of the individual, that we are a collective species. I'll say something about that in a second, expand on that in a second. What our BPD clients, due to their developmental history, face is well, there are two pitfalls, as it were, for that really adverse environments can create. Either you come to trust someone who is very untrustworthy, and this is the Mary Main idea about disorganized attachment. I know Marinus has put forward a slightly different model, but her idea is that the borderline patient, the disorganized attachment child is in what Mary Main calls an approach avoidance dilemma. In other words, that child, when threatened, seeks out an attachment figure, due to the attachment dynamic, which is built into our genetic makeup. But if the attachment figure is the very source of that threat, then that child has kind of got a real problem. Because the very person that they're going to go to for help is the very person who has created the situation that results in them needing help. So that's particularly relevant to physical and sexual abuse, and how neglect fits in with that is another story. So though those disorganized children, when they get a bit older, are really faced with one of two dilemmas. One is that they can't trust anybody, or, as it were, they trust the wrong people. And that's what happens when you get into gang culture, because you need a strong attachment figure. But that strong attachment figure may then exploit you or abuse you. So I suppose the issue in therapy is, as I said, you've either got to begin to create a culture of in which the therapist can be trusted. And I think many of the sort of non-specific features of therapy, the regularity and the consistency, the freedom from interruption that a therapy session represents, can, over time, however much the client may attempt to disrupt it, begin to create an environment where another individual can be trusted. So I don't know that answers that point, but I just wanted to make, since I've got the floor, as it were, at the moment, I just wanted to push a little bit further on, because I think in one of the questions to Annie was, how can we kind of expand this idea of evolutionary psychiatry? Well, I think somebody who's really made a big effort in this world is David Sloan Wilson. I mentioned his book, This View of Life, which is of course a quote from Darwin, but he's created an evolution institute at his university in upstate New York, and also a movement which he calls pro-social world. And I do strongly recommend anybody who's interested in this area to Google pro-social world and see how he's trying to show how evolutionary ideas can inform all areas of social life, including medicine, psychiatry, but also education, etc.
Well, thank you very much